And welcome to today's webinar, an introduction to resilience for trauma-informed professionals, or RTIP, for juvenile defense attorneys, sponsored by the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, and our presenter today, Dr. Patricia Carrig. Oops, went one too far there. In case you're not familiar with us, the CTRJJ is a training and technical assistance center affiliated with the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, or NCTSN, with funding through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. The mission of the CTRJJ is to support a comprehensive framework for developing, adopting, implementing and sustaining evidence-based trauma-informed services for youth who are at risk for justice system involvement or in the juvenile justice system. In addition to supporting youth, the CTRJJ also supports parents and caregivers, and consistent with this mission, the CTRJJ also emphasizes the importance of a trauma-informed workforce and equipping juvenile justice professionals with the skills necessary to carry out this critical work. And so, on behalf of my other CTRJJ co-directors, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar. And a few housekeeping points. Please submit your questions during the presentation through the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Dr. Carrig will address as many of those questions as time permits at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar is also being recorded, and it will be made available on the CTRJJ YouTube channel. And at the end of the presentation today, you'll be provided an access point to a downloadable certificate. Now, this certificate does not provide CE, or in your case, CLE credit, but can be used internally within your organization to acknowledge your participation and for tracking professional development. And I'd like to introduce to you today our presenter, Dr. Patricia Carrig, is a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Utah and a faculty member of the CTRJJ. Her research focuses on understanding the developmental processes that link childhood trauma exposure to adolescent justice involvement and also to resilience. Through the CTRJJ, she's contributed to efforts to develop and disseminate evidence-based trauma-informed practices in a way that protects staff from the effects of exposure to secondary traumatic stress. And with that, I'd like to turn this over to Dr. Carrig, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Keith, and it's a pleasure to be with you all today. This next slide, there we go, gives you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. First, we're going to define secondary traumatic stress, and we're going to talk about going beyond self-care to take a resilience-focused approach. And then I'll introduce you to some of the tools in the RTIP toolbox, and along the way, we'll do a skill building exercise together. But I want to start today where I always like to start in introducing this topic, which is to tell you about what inspired me to become involved in this work. This was several years ago now, when, as part of my work with the Center for Trauma Recovery and Juvenile Justice, I was doing trainings around the country using a curriculum called Think Trauma. And at that time, in the very first edition of Think Trauma, it was very much focused on increasing awareness of trauma amongst juvenile justice professionals, and included some very graphic case examples that sometimes got a reaction from the audience. And at the end of one of these trainings, which was to a group of probation officers in Provo, Utah, a gentleman who'd been sitting quietly throughout raised his hand and said, "You've convinced me it's important for us to know about whether the youth we're working with have experienced trauma, but I don't want to be the one to do this work." And I was taken aback, and I asked him, "Tell me more, what you're thinking." And he said, "Because if a youth I was working with told me that any of these terrible things had happened to them, I wouldn't know what to say." And I thought to myself, that makes perfect sense. You're trained as a probation officer. You haven't been trained in how to respond helpfully when youth disclose trauma. And maybe even more significantly, you haven't been trained in how to cope with the thoughts and feelings that can arise when we learn about others' traumas. So I thought to myself that something more was needed, and I set myself on a journey of discovery to learn all that I could about how we're affected by exposure to others' traumas and what is helpful in the aftermath. And I found a lot of wonderful resources that I'll share with you today. But I also observed some gaps, and I'll talk about those today as well. So, who in the juvenile justice system is exposed to others' traumas? Well, it turns out that we all are, from juvenile defense attorneys, guardians ad litem, those who work in child welfare, immigration, and educational settings, as well as juvenile prosecutors, judges and court staff, probation officers, residential staff, and mental health providers. There are a number of unique ways in which each of these professions is exposed to secondary traumatic stress, and I'll talk a little bit about that in relation to the listening sessions that I've been conducting. But there are also some common themes that arise, including reading trauma-filled case histories, hearing trauma disclosures, viewing graphic evidence, interacting with distressed youth and their family members, and listening to our colleagues talk about their cases. And in addition, especially professionals who go into institutional settings or the homes of their clients, this goes beyond hearing about things that happened in the past, but also immediate sensory inputs, sounds, scents, etc., that tell us in a very visceral way that something bad has happened here. Well, why should we be concerned about exposure to others' traumas? In fact, exposure to others' traumas has a real impact on us. As Tim Wires puts it so elegantly, you don't have to be shot to go through a shooting. And in fact, exposure to others' traumas is a potential source of trauma for us. This may seem self-evident now, but it's interesting to know that this wasn't always recognized to be the case. The long-standing definition of what comprises a traumatic event is that it is exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or sexual violence through either experiencing it directly ourselves, witnessing it in person, or learning that the event has happened to a loved one. And this we can term primary trauma exposure. But for the first time in the most recent revision of the diagnostic manual, the definition was expanded to include repeated or extreme exposure to someone else's trauma. And the definition goes on to give the example of officers being repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse. So if this is the case, um, that this is secondary traumatic stress, that if this is the case, then going beyond a personal responsibility to engage in self-care, addressing STS is a professional competency for those of us whose work involves traumatized individuals or trauma-related material. So beyond self-care, recognizing, preventing, and responding to STS involves skills that are crucial tools in our professional toolkits. But I want to be sure to say, even though I'm talking about STS in the context of a diagnostic manual, Having a reaction to others' traumas is not a sign of psychopathology. Far from it. It's only human. PTSD and STS come into play when those reactions cause us significant distress or interfere with our ability to function. After all, expecting that we can be exposed to trauma-related information every day in our work lives without being affected is, as Rachel Raymond says, as unrealistic as expecting to be able to wade through water without getting wet. So before I go further, I want to talk a bit about the different terms that are used in this literature. They're often used as though they're interchangeable, but I think each of them is capturing a unique facet of a multifaceted phenomenon. So one term we hear used a lot is burnout. And burnout refers to feelings of emotional exhaustion, alienation, and ineffectiveness that can come about when we feel powerless and unappreciated in the work we do. And certainly, burnout is something that can happen when people are engaged with traumatized individuals or trauma related information. But what's important to note about burnout is it's not specific to trauma. The person who flips burgers at Burger King can experience burnout if they feel powerless and unappreciated in their work. Another term that has been proposed is compassion fatigue. And this captures well that feeling of being emotionally spent by caring for others without being able to replenish our own reserves. We've gone to the well once too often, and the well is dry. But this is a bit of a problematic term, and I want to explain why I say that. There is a wonderful animated film that Brene Brown created that illustrates the difference between empathy and sympathy. And in this film, the little fox has climbed down into the well of despair. And other animals come by and offer sympathy. Hey, looks like you're having a rough day. Hope you feel better soon. But the empathetic bear comes down into the well and shares the fox's experience with him. The fox appreciates it. The fox feels no longer so alone and feels understood. But if you look at this image, you can see they both now have black clouds of despair over their heads. And I find myself wondering what is going to happen to that bear. So if empathy is sharing in another person's feeling state, compassion is something different. Compassion involves seeing that another person is in suffering or in need of help and wanting to help them. So with compassion, we don't climb down into the well of despair. We throw the other person a lifeline to help them up. And when we're working in a context in which we have a mutually supportive social ecology, we don't need to do this alone. We all have one another's backs. So I think that this term compassion fatigue is better termed empathy fatigue. Another term that's used frequently is vicarious trauma. And I think this captures really well the changes in our own inner experience that can come about when we have engaged empathically with a traumatized person. And one of the reasons why I think this is a really valuable construct is it's related to another one that's termed moral injury. So I want to take a moment to talk about that. According to Brett Litz and his colleagues, moral injury refers to perpetrating, failing to prevent, bearing witness to, or learning about acts that transgress our own deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. The study of moral injury originated with military personnel who were coming back from service troubled by things that they had seen or things that they had been required to do. But in recent years, it's a construct that has been expanded to a wide variety of different populations, including in my own lab, youth involved in the juvenile justice system and youth involved in gangs. They have no difficulty understanding this concept and recognizing things that they have done, either on their own initiative or under duress, things that they've stood by and allowed to happen, or things that they've witnessed that they felt were deeply wrong. But of all of the dimensions of moral injury, the one that we have found to be most impactful is betrayal. When somebody we should have been able to turn to for protection and care has done something that we think is deeply wrong. So then the last term, secondary traumatic stress, in the formal sense of the term, refers to the presence of any of the symptoms of PTSD, which include intrusive thoughts and images, efforts to avoid reminders of the trauma, changes in our thoughts and mood, and hyperarousal that result from exposure to someone else's trauma. And because I think of STS as being on the extreme end of the continuum and incorporating each of the other dimensions, it's the term that I've been using. Another reason why these terms are so useful to keep in mind is there also can be the opposite. So, just as there can be so called compassion fatigue or empathy fatigue, there can also be compassion satisfaction that we experience when we enjoy positive relationships with our coworkers, when we're competent at our job, and when we know that our work is making a meaningful difference. And just as there can be vicarious trauma, there can also be vicarious resilience, the uplift that we get from witnessing another person's recovery from trauma. So, we do have research that tells us a little bit about the risk and protective factors for STS. One major one is an isolative work environment, whereas connection and support from our coworkers can be protective. Another risk is the sheer volume of trauma exposure for people whose work involves day in and day out exposure to trauma. The risk is high. But support and helpful debriefing, which we'll talk about in a bit, can alleviate those effects. Some research shows that people who are high in empathy are more vulnerable, while compassion satisfaction can be protective. A major one is having shame about our own STS reactions, that we're professionals and we're not supposed to have these thoughts and feelings, whereas openness and acknowledgement can be helpful. Some research shows that people who come into this work with their own history of exposure to adverse childhood experiences or traumas can be more vulnerable, but that's not absolute. Having made meaning of those experiences and come to resolution can erase that link. And then the last thing on this list is not something we have empirical data on yet, but I'm hoping that we will gather it because this is my hypothesis that going into this work with a lack of training and preparation for dealing with STS in and of itself increases the risk of negative reactions. Whereas knowing that we have the tools in our toolkits to deal with what comes in our way is, I believe, going to be protective. So, what does secondary traumatic stress look like? Well, it depends on who you ask. But one of the resources that I found that I really appreciated is a book by Laura Vandernoot Lipsky titled Trauma Stewardship. And in this book, she argues that if we're going to work with survivors of trauma, we need to be good stewards or caretakers, not only of their well being, but of our own and our capacity to be helpful. One of the things I love about her work is her use of humor. And she got permission to use a number of evocative cartoons from the New York Times, which I also asked for permission because I think they give us some insights into what STS can look like. So let's see. One sign is feelings of helplessness or low self-efficacy. And although I think this is a very funny cartoon, I'm going to take exception to it a little bit later. Working hard, but feeling like we're not doing enough. We're just howling at the moon. That feeling of hypervigilance, of being always on, barking at everything. Loss of pleasure in life. Who are these little people in my living room? A big one that I hear a lot from people is cynicism when they find that they've lost their sense of optimism and meaning in the work they do. And alternatively, feeling trapped by our own indispensability, that we're the only ones who can put out this forest fire. Although these are humorous cartoons, they're also being used to illustrate some real life experiences. So, for example, here's an animal rescue worker talking about no matter how many lives she saves, she can only think about the ones she has failed to save, and that feels like a personal failure. Here, a community organizer talks about all her energy going into getting through the day and then coming home and going round and round the dial. Here, a domestic violence advocate talks about not being able to even take pleasure in looking at the photos of a friend's wedding without the intrusive thought coming into their mind, I wonder when the domestic violence is going to start. And here, an attorney for death row inmates talks about it's not just a feeling that I can't do enough. If I don't do it, it won't get done, and people could be harmed. So, signs of STS can be physical, including physical exhaustion, not sleeping or oversleeping, headaches, stomach aches, even getting sick more often as our immune system is affected. They may be behavioral, increased substance use or other kinds of addictive behaviors, whether that's to the internet, shopping, gambling, or even workaholism. Anger and irritability, socially isolating, and what Francoise Mathieu calls the silencing response, shutting other people down, communicating in all sorts of ways that we're full up to here and we can't take on anymore. The signs may be psychological, including emotional exhaustion, feelings of ineffectiveness, the reduced empathy and cynicism and loss of pleasure in life, a changed worldview when moral injury enters into it, any of the symptoms associated with PTSD. And here there are also some important individual differences where some people will show an oversensitivity, an inability to tolerate watching movies or television shows that have any reminders of the kinds of traumas they're exposed to at work. Other people will show a kind of undersensitivity and even seek out that kind of stimulation as though in an attempt to master it. And some signs may be professional, that overburdened sense of responsibility and being always on, or the reverse, avoiding work, resenting the demands of the workday, and overall difficulty separating work and personal life. And although I'm talking about these as separate components, of course, they tend to co-occur and interact with one another. So I had alluded in the beginning to the listening sessions that I've been conducting, asking members of different professions in the juvenile justice system about how is it that you encounter secondary trauma, and how does it affect you and the people around you? And so I wanted to give you a little bit of a snapshot of what I have heard from juvenile defense attorneys. What I was told is that there are a lot of tears and a lot of drinking. Happy hour was described as a place that people come together to blow off steam, but not to talk about it. As one attorney told me, no one talks about this stuff. Another said that there are very few role models for getting through this, that some long-term veterans seem resigned and almost robotic as though they're going through the motions, whereas others seem to have lost their boundaries and to have developed a sort of a savior complex and being emotionally over-involved with their cases. Defense attorneys talked about having nightmares about their cases and trouble sleeping, and importantly, that the effects intrude on their personal lives. One talked about what they described as imploding personal relationships. This person said, "We come home heavy with all we've been exposed to and just want to curl up on the couch and not interact." They also talked about a loss of a sense of purpose and the meaning in why they do this work. Well, does nobody know about this? Is this new information? I was really struck when I went into the literature how many studies dating back a couple of decades have been done that show recognition of the fact that secondary traumatic stress, in whatever terminology is used, is relevant to attorneys. So this is not new information. And in fact, recently, a court system in Australia was found liable for not protecting its staff, by not providing a safe workplace, by protecting judicial officers from the harms of what they were calling vicarious trauma exposure. The court determined that there is a duty of care where exposure of an employee to trauma is inherent in the work they do. So clearly, STS is a psychological hazard that deserves our attention. So, what do we know about what helps in the aftermath of exposure to STS? When we go to the literature, almost universally, we find a reference to self care, a virtual sea of self care. And there are measures that have been developed that can help us to track whether we are engaging in healthy self-care activities. And these usually include things like taking time off when it's allowed, engaging in relaxing activities, getting exercise, eating well, and staying connected to our spiritual and social supports. But what happens when busy, stressed people come home at the end of the day? Sometimes the self care strategies that are most immediately available to us are not necessarily the ones that are going to be most helpful in the long term. But there's more to it than that. There's some reason to believe that self care itself has limitations. And one study that I found particularly striking followed a group of trauma professionals who participated in trainings that were focused on self care. The first finding is that this was not associated with an increase in the amount of time that they actually spent on self care activities. This is perhaps not surprising. We don't always do the things that we know we're supposed to do. But the even more surprising finding was the amount of time spent in self care was not associated with lower secondary traumatic stress. Well, why might this be the case? There are some ideas that I can suggest. A major one is that most suggested self care activities, go take a spa day, get a mani pedi, etc., take place long after trauma exposure and are divorced from our workplace. Instead, I would argue that we need strategies we can use in the moment, in the here and now. We also need proactive strategies we can use in anticipation of exposure and activities that are integrated with our workplace environments. Another potential limitation of self care is that it doesn't take into account individual differences that are associated with our own cultures and our backgrounds. Our cultural perspectives can influence the beliefs we have about what it is that's disrupted by trauma, our worldviews regarding the extent to which we are subject to fate or have individual agency. And importantly, our beliefs can affect what we understand about the processes that can lead to healing in the aftermath of trauma, whether primary and secondary. So the idea that activities that are focused on self-care will be helpful to us may not ring true to all cultures. This was brought home to me by one of my students who emigrated to the United States from Cuba. And she said that when she looked at these self-care inventories, they weren't relevant to her at all, that she wouldn't go give herself some sort of a treat. If she wanted to overcome the effects of STS, she would go home and cook a big feast and invite all her family and neighbors to come partake of it. So these cultural differences are important for us to keep in mind. So, what would be an alternative to a self care approach? One alternative is to think in terms of resilience, but what do we mean by that? When people first started studying resilience, they talked about it as though there were some people who were just magically armor plated. They could walk through fire without being burned. They were impervious to all adversity. But as we've studied resilience more, we've learned that that's not an accurate depiction, that people who are resilient are still affected by the experiences they have. And that's just as well, because having to walk around in a suit and armor would be a hot and heavy and uncomfortable thing. I also don't think resilience is captured well by the idea of wearing a psychological hazmat suit that isolates us from the pathogens around us. In fact, having emotions related to our work is not only human. Emotions are a valuable tool because they tell us when there's something that we need to pay attention to. So I think of resilience as Successful adaptation in the face of challenges while recognizing that resilient people are affected by their experiences. It's also not an all or nothing phenomenon. We can be resilient in some ways, even if we're struggling in others. And it's also not a personality trait. It's not just a matter of our own true grit. Instead, resilience is made up of strengths and protective factors in a number of different domains. One of those domains is the emotional. Our capacity to be aware of our emotions, to regulate them, and to cope with them with honesty and humility. A second domain is the cognitive domain, our capacity to make meaning of our experiences, to retain our sense of optimism and connection to our cultural and family values. And a third domain is the interpersonal, our capacity to remain generative, to have compassion for ourselves and others, and stay connected to our social supports and sense of community. So, what would enable us to be resilient when we encounter secondary traumatic stress? I would argue that just like exposure to primary traumas, secondary traumatic stress dysregulates us physically, emotionally, cognitively, and maybe even morally. So, and it causes us to experience as though it's happening in the present, something that has happened in the past. So, if this is true, the strategies that will be protective for us are those that reestablish our balance, that ground us in the present, and that dispel unhelpful thoughts and interpretations. So, with this resilience framework in mind, I developed Resilience for Trauma Informed Professionals. And there's an article I've written that talks about the conceptual underpinnings. But I thought a better way to introduce you to RTIP is to describe how it's organized around the different stages of our encounter with trauma related material. And each of these I'm going to go into in more depth, but just to give you a snapshot. First, are there ways that we can prevent unnecessary exposures? Second, what can we do prior to exposure to increase our resilience? Third, what can we do during exposures in the here and now? And this was the missing piece that I saw in most of the trainings that I looked at. And then last, what can we do after exposures to monitor our well-being and recover our balance? So I'm going to give you next some descriptors of some of the tools in each of these stages of the encounter. And these come from the workbook that I created that accompanies the RTIP training. So first, are there ways that we can prevent unnecessary exposures to secondary trauma? One question that I think is worth considering is, what is our purpose when we gather detailed trauma histories? What are we going to do with that information? In some contexts, this is used to identify which youth have been affected by post-traumatic stress and are in need of trauma-informed services. But if that's the case, maybe the most important information to gather is about the symptoms that youth are showing in the present rather than detailed information about what happened in the past. And there's some tools we have developed to do that. One of which is the triggers and coping strategies or safety plan. that has three components. The first page invites youth to identify what is triggering for them. Um, what is it that is upsetting or pushes their buttons? And this will be very different for different youth. For some, it's going to be feeling abandoned and left alone. For others, it will be feeling overcrowded and intruded upon. The second page invites youth to identify the ways that they would show that they had been triggered. Again, this will be very different. For some youth, it'll be getting loud and cursing. For others, it will be becoming very, very quiet. And then the third page invites youth to talk about what is helpful to them when they have been triggered. Whether that's for somebody to come into their space and be close to them, or whether that's somebody giving them time to be on their own. We also talk about ways in which we can protect our colleagues and one another. STS can be contagious. So when we seek support or debrief after we've heard a terrible story, we might inadvertently be passing on the trauma to the person we're debriefing with. So we talk about strategies for debriefing that lessen the impact on others and make sure that they're ready for what we have to share. And excuse me, if we have time at the end, I can come back and talk more about that. Excuse me. All right. We also talk about some of the things that can keep us stuck in a trauma story, even after we've had a chance to debrief. And here we talk about the role of appraisals or interpretations. These are the meanings that we make about the event, about what it means about ourselves, other people, or the world around us, which can affect our emotions, our behavior, and how we interact with others, but importantly, are open to change. I'm going to skip next to the third stage of our encounter with STS, in which we talk about the tools we need to have ready in our toolboxes in the here and now. If you recall that probation officer I described who told me his concern that if a youth disclosed to him, he wouldn't know what to say. Well, we take that scenario into account. And one of the worksheets in the workbook takes us through exactly that scenario. When a youth discloses trauma, what is helpful to say and what is not helpful? Another worksheet walks us through an even more challenging scenario. Should somebody become triggered and have a full-blown post-traumatic stress reaction in our presence, what would we do and what would we say? And throughout the curriculum, we pay attention to individual differences. The strategies that are helpful for one person won't necessarily be helpful for others. So what we want to strive for is not to have just a single use tool in our toolbox, but a Swiss Army knife that's readily adaptable. And then last, we talk about strategies we can use to recover our balance in the aftermath of STS. One important skill is to recognize when we're affected by STS. And there are some great tools available to do this, including an online measure that you can fill out and score that gives you a readout on your level of burnout, excuse me, STS, and compassion satisfaction. But a limit of this tool is that it doesn't account for those individual differences. One person's signs of STS may not be another person's. So the other tool that I want to introduce you to, and we're going to do a deeper dive into this, is one that allows you to develop your own personal early warning system for STS exposure. And this is called a dosimeter. It's named after the little badge that an X-ray technician wears that lets them know if they've been exposed to an unhealthy dose of X-rays. So the first thing the dosimeter asks us to do is to think about what we're like when we're in our green zone, when we're calm and at our best, relaxed, unstressed, and thinking clearly. Then what are we like when we're in our yellow zone and just beginning to be affected by STS? What are those first signs that tell us we'd benefit from taking a step back to recover our balance? And then what are we like when we're in our red zone and STS has completely gotten the better of us? We also talk about the value of differentiating the signs that you show at work versus the signs you might bring home. Many of the folks, excuse me, I've talked to in my listening sessions have emphasized that they're able to be consummate professionals while they're at work. It's when they come home that things begin to unravel. And when I ask people who is the best source of information to fill out your dosimeter, often their first thought is, well, me, I know myself best. But it may be that there are things those around you notice that you're not aware of. For example, one of my colleagues told me, I can always tell when you're starting to be affected by the work you do. And I said, oh, really? How? And she said, because you lose your sense of humor. And I was completely unaware of that. I thought she just wasn't being very funny anymore. So the dosimeter becomes part of a larger STS protection toolkit that we each develop in an individualized way that builds in a recognition of our warning signs, a regular time for self-check, recognition of the strategies that help us to anticipate exposures, the strategies that are most helpful to us during exposure and after exposure, and the ways that we build our resilience and increase our compassion satisfaction in the long run. We don't forget the lessons of that study I mentioned that said that participating in self-care trainings doesn't help. So we spend time talking about all the things that can get in the way, including reading about self-regulation skills or attending trainings without practicing them, which, as to quote Francoise Mathieu again, is like trying to fix a flat tire by reading your car's owner's manual. Importantly, we talk about how addressing STS requires attention at multiple levels. There are professional skills we can develop. There's a personal investment we each need to make in nurturing our own resilience and compassion satisfaction. But it's essential that there be organizational supports that monitor, respond, and protect staff. So here we are back to these prior to exposure strategies for building our resilience. I won't have time to talk much about this here, but as an illustration, this was a worksheet that was inspired by attorneys who attended trainings I had done, and they talked about the impact of viewing graphic material, whether those are reports or videos or listening to audio tapes, often over and over again when preparing for procedures. And in thinking about how to address this, I came up with two worksheets, the first of which is for organizations and supervisors regarding how they can acknowledge, protect, and monitor and respond to staff, as well as some guides for the staff doing this work themselves. So again, the organizational strategies that are essential involve prevention where possible, monitoring ongoing staff well-being, and responding to affected staff, including providing resources and referrals to mental health when needed, because, as I mentioned, this cartoon is funny, but seeking therapy is, in fact, an act of high self-efficacy. There are some wonderful resources for organizations that want to become trauma-informed and responsive, including guides for STS-informed supervision. Here I'm sharing some of my favorite resources on resilience and recovery in the aftermath of STS. There are also some wonderful resources that come from justice-related organizations specifically. And with that, I will be very interested to hear your questions and comments.
So I would invite, thank you so much, Patricia, and I would invite anyone if they have a question to please feel free to post it in the Q&A using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen as well. And one, Patricia, that I gave a shot at answering, which maybe as well, we'll wait to see if maybe some more come in, is a question was asked is, essentially, how deep or saturated do you think the literature is when it comes to STS and juvenile justice professionals? Are you seeing any gaps in our knowledge, and maybe any thoughts of what are some of those gaps and what we may need more information on?
Oh, wow, that's such a good question. I think that despite the fact that there have been several studies that I flashed on the screen that are focused on juvenile justice professionals, this has happened uh, really without a lot of attention being paid to it. I don't think that this is something that has saturated our approach to juvenile justice. And I think that it was one of the things that I saw in, for example, the Think Trauma curriculum, that when it was originally uh, put out there, that it was an afterthought, that people would be affected by the case studies that were being presented, and that this was not just an exposure in and of itself, but was added weight onto justice professionals who were coming to these trainings, having heard these stories and being exposed to this kind of information. So I think that it's something that we haven't thought enough about. Another way in which I have felt like we've been lagging behind is, as justice systems have become trauma informed, almost universally that is translated into, we need to do trauma screenings, we need to gather trauma histories, without all saying, and we need to first prepare the staff who are going to do this so that they're protected against the potential negative effects. When I heard from the attorneys at my training about the impact of this repeated viewing of evidence, at that time I thought, I wasn't hearing about this in any other context, that this was really not being attended to. And there's no preparation, no training, no guardrails on this kind of work. In other contexts, such as in medical care, there are committees in which people's job every hour of every day is to view evidence of terrible events as part of quality control. And as you can imagine, the rates of attrition from those jobs are huge. So I think this is something that has been talked about, but hasn't been built into uh, trauma-informed care in the justice system in the way that it really needs to be.
Yeah, Patricia, that's really helpful. And one question that comes to mind for me that I think may be helpful for you just to comment on, because I think this happens in a lot of contexts, and I'm sure it happens with defense attorneys as well, is the quote gallows humor that can
Mhm.
happen in the workplace. It's the kind of maybe the somewhat flippant, but the discussion of, the difficult case and maybe talking about the traumas. And I'm wondering if you have any comment on that, especially when it's occurring, in the conference room, in between meetings, or even maybe in that after work happy hour. Any
Mhm.
comment or reflection on that in terms of potential strengths, potential positives for that
Mhm.
versus negatives and
Mhm.
some pitfalls that can occur with that.
I think it's a multifaceted phenomenon. I think that humor is so important. It allows us to look at and talk about really difficult things in a way that's softens some of the sharp edges. So I'm a great proponent of humor. And sometimes people are working in contexts where the humor is going to be dark. I think the potential negative is if it discourages others from acknowledging that they are having tender feelings about something, that it becomes a kind of armor that everyone wears. Um, and that doesn't give people permission to really show or even have the feelings that they're having. So I think it can be complicated in that
Yeah,
way.
yeah, that's really great. And Patricia, another question came in is, do you think the shift to virtual or work from home, where there's less of those casual interactions that potentially could be buffering, um, or just that disconnection from those colleagues that may be part of your support system, any impact do you think that this might be having on prevalence of STS?
Super good question. I think that that's an important consideration. Um, those, running into somebody in the hallway or, the break room and being able to have a brief moment of connection and support is really valuable. And that's something that doesn't happen by the by when people are virtual. It's one of the reasons why when I do trainings, we talk a lot about how people can be mindful of building in ways to create that kind of connection, even when they are in a virtual environment. It was one of the things that I considered when I was developing the guidelines for viewing difficult material, is that a lot of people are doing this online in isolation. And we talked about strategies for building a team where if one person is going to be looking at a horrific video, there's somebody else who's online at the same time that they know they can make a connection with afterwards. Even just to say, wow, I just looked at something that was really rough. What do you do that helps you when you've seen something really rough? We didn't get a chance to talk about the limited impact debriefing, but just the important take home message there is we can gain from debriefing in ways that don't involve describing in gory detail, the graphic material we have looked at, but just having that connection of the work we do can be really tough. You feel that way too, don't you? And having that human connection.
That's excellent. Thank you, Patricia. And we've been cycling through a couple of final slides as we come up to our to the top of the hour here. I'd like to leave this here for a moment. Is if you would like to connect with the CTRJJ in terms of a number of resources through our center, you can scan this QR code, which will also be made available in the follow-up email that you'll receive. And I would also like to provide that slide that will allow you to access a website where you can click on the website and enter the password attorney and download a certificate for that would acknowledge your attendance at this webinar. And please feel free to grab your phone and take a snapshot of this as well. And so you can have that and then to access the QR code. And we'll also try to put it in the chat function for you to be able to click on that before we sign off or end the webinar as well. I would personally really like to thank you, Patricia, for this information today, and thank you everyone for attending.